It's Friday, February 20th. Welcome to another episode of Washington in Focus Daily. I'm Carleen Johnson, the Center Square's state government reporter. It is day 40 of the legislative session. That means we are 2/3 of the way through the 2026 session scheduled to end on March 12th. And plenty of buzz here at the Capitol today about the U.S. Supreme Court ruling against President Trump's tariffs. So everything happening in the other Washington was all the buzz in this Washington today. And I spoke this morning with State GOP Chairman Jim Walsh to kind of get his take, his thoughts about the decision from the U.S. Supreme Court against the Trump administration, and also got some of his insights on how he thinks the Washington tech sector and other businesses may respond to this ruling. Then we'll get into an important bill moving forward for Washington's ag and farming communities. This is Representative Tom Dent's bill concerning a task force to really dive into some of the regulations and other pressures on ag and how that's led to a very high suicide rate. It's something that Representative Dent is very passionate about, losing his own grandfather many years ago to suicide. And then we're going to be talking with our colleagues, TJ Martinell and Tim Clouser, a very critical ruling, a bill that's moving forward that pretty much would let the Office of State Attorney General Nick Brown get into civil matters and ask for your own personal documents if he's got a case against you, and then issue a Trump-style gag order, it seems, that would prevent you from even talking about that or going to the media. So lots to dive into. So let's start with thing one on the tariffs ruling. So in case you were under a rock today and you missed this, there was an historic 6-3 decision that came down this morning. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the tariff tax increases that were imposed by the executive branch under emergency powers of President Trump are unconstitutional. And the ruling reaffirms that the power to tax is exclusively reserved to the legislative branch, meaning that Congress could do it, but the president couldn't do it on his own. Part of that ruling, it was a 170-page opinion with several concurrences. And in part of that, the court basically said, the Constitution specifies that it is Congress that has the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises. And they recognize the unique importance of this taxing power to impose tariffs to that of Congress, not for the executive branch alone to do. If you're on social media, you may have seen some of President Trump's posts to Truth Social, including one today that said, "The Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs is deeply disappointing. I'm ashamed of certain members of the court for not having the courage," he said, "to do what is right for our country." Then he went on to thank and congratulate Justices Alito, Kavanaugh for their strength, wisdom, love of country, which he says has every, this is Trump saying, every American is proud of you at this point. So now tariffs have been something that have even divided conservatives and Trump supporters. Not everybody's been happy about this. And many suggested if the court had allowed, this unilateral tariff power for the executive branch to stand, nothing was in the way to prevent a future president from declaring something like maybe a climate emergency to impose tariff tax increases. So lots of division on this, even among Republicans. And earlier today, I met with GOP State Chair Jim Walsh of Aberdeen for his take on the ruling, which he told me didn't really come as a surprise.
The Supreme Court ruling was not surprising. I think they made a legitimate point. If you're going to use tariffs as a trade tool, you need to use them not in a broad stroke way, but in each decision, each tariff policy point made specifically to an industry, to a trading partner on a much more narrowly tailored basis. And I imagine that's what the administration will do going forward. The real issue is that there's going to be a fiscal effect. The federal government was benefiting from proceeds from these broadly applied tariffs. And they're going to have to take that into account, that now they're not going to be getting some of those dollars in, at least not at the same timeline that they were originally.
And then I pressed Representative Walsh a little bit further for his take on what the impact is going to be to a very trade dependent state like Washington. And of course, all the big tech sector that we have here, they've made clear that the tariffs were hurting them. A lot of the retail sector has been very loudly complaining about the tariffs and the harm to their industry. So here's his take on the impacts for Washington state trade and the tech sector.
The administration still can apply more narrowly tailored tariffs to specific circumstances and may do that right quick. But I think in general, this will be perceived as something that the business community likes, both tech industry and the transportation trade organizations that operate out of our ports and other places. I think they will probably like this ruling.
I'm going to be publishing an article later today on Friday the 20th for some further reaction on the SCOTUS decision about Trump's tariffs. Got some responses from the Washington Council on International Trade. They thought it was a step in the right direction. A little bit of a different take from the National Federation of Independent Business and the state director here in Washington, who said, basically, wherever you come down on this, we're more focused now on what the pending millionaires tax here in Washington state could do to business going forward. So a lot more on that. You'll be able to see that article linked today at thecentersquare.com/Washington. So lots more reaction coming in on that throughout the day today. All right, let's move on to thing two. And this is, I think, something that not a lot of other reporters are talking about, but I know it's something hugely important to our state because of the critical ag and farming community in central and eastern Washington. I know we've got a lot of that across the state, but mostly in central and eastern Washington. So this legislation from Representative Dent would create a task force that would take a comprehensive look at how state regulations impact Washington farmers and ranchers. The bill's already passed out of the State House of Representatives. I think there were only 2 no votes on this when it passed out last week, and it has now moved to the House. And Representative Dent of Moses Lake is himself an ag guy. I know he's a hay farmer. I think he currently has some buffalo or bison as well. He's going to be mad at me when he sees this that I didn't remember exactly what kind of animals he has on his property, but he told me that he ended up storing all of his hay last season because he was going to take a loss. And that was an example of the part of the stress on the farming community. You don't know from one season to the next how much success you're going to have. A lot of that is weather dependent, but a lot of that has to do with regulations in the state of Washington, from land zoning to water resources, grazing rights, pesticide use. I mean, this was a shocking statistic that I got from Representative Dent. The Washington State Farm Bureau reports there are 70,000 regulations on Washington state farmers. And ag now across the country, particularly here in the state of Washington, has had the highest suicide rate of any industry in the country. Farmers are 3.5 more times likely to die by suicide than the general population. And that comes from the National Rural Health Association. So Representative Dent's family has been farming for well over a century. As I mentioned, his own grandfather took his life well before he was born due to stresses on his community. And his contention and the focus of this legislation is, let's look at the regulations and find out where we can maybe lift off burdens for these people that are struggling under financial pressures that obviously lead to then mental health stressors. So here is part of my conversation with Representative Tom Dent of Moses Lake on his bill, which, if you want to look that up, I should have sent earlier. This is House Bill 2619. Here's Representative Dent.
You're a farmer, you're a rancher. It's not a job. It's not an occupation. It's a way of life. You're not out there to do it because, oh, this is a good job. No, you're out there because you love doing it. And you got to love doing it to work, 12, 14, 16, sometimes 18-hour days, right? You have to love it. And it's who you are. And so how does somebody who is out there doing what they want to do, doing, who they are, okay? Get themselves in a position where their mental health deteriorates to the point that they seem like suicide is the only way out. So, and it's like the financial pressures become strong. Suicide is the only way out. So how are they going to keep the farm together? Are they letting grandpa down, great grandpa down, whoever founded the farm? Because many times they're passed down. All these things. They're letting the family down. They're letting the community down. They're letting their friends down. I mean, I'm a rancher. I'm a farmer. I'm doing this stuff, and everybody's counting on me, and they all hold me to some high level of esteem because you should be as a farmer or a rancher because you're doing something really important in this world. The way our farm economy is today in the state of Washington, I don't think there's a commodity out there that's really making money. What they're doing is the farmers, they live on their equity. So the equity they have in their equipment, in their farms, in their land, and whatever, they're borrowing money back against that, okay? Or they're refinancing so they can pay off loans and get back, and so then they have less equity, and that's what they're doing. They're living on their equity. So, my passion around this is somewhat personal in a way, because I don't believe that the way we're handling this with our farmers and ranchers, I don't think we honor them enough. I don't think we respect what they do for us enough, and we need to do that. We meaning the society as a whole, but in the legislature too, right? It's like, hey, they feed us, they take care of us. What are we going to do if they don't feed us anymore?
So representatives bill to create a task force to figure out which of these regulations can maybe be lifted and what else they can do to help this stressed critical sector of our economy. This task force moving forward, it would be, by the way, lawmakers from both chambers, state agency representatives from agriculture, commerce, ecology. And the bill has moved to the Senate. It received a public hearing actually yesterday on Thursday, and is now set for executive session on Monday in the Senate Committee on Ag and Natural Resources at 1:30. So if you want to track that, we'll be providing updates next week as well. Moving on to thing 3 for today. Boy, it is Friday. It feels like it's got to be a Friday. A bill expanding powers to the Office of Attorney General Nick Brown, which would allow him to issue civil investigative demand. And so that's basically a public records request. When we're in the media, we can put in, a FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act, or public records requests to state agencies, state agency leaders and their staff members, and say, hey, we want to see what you were discussing when you were talking about this bill or this new law that you're seeking to implement. We can get those through public records requests, although it often takes months. This would allow his agency to do the same for a private individual without a court warrant, and the AG would be able to issue a gag order so you couldn't talk about it either. So here are my colleagues TJ Martinell and Tim Klauser, part of our Center Square Washington team, with the story.
Welcome to another segment of Washington in Focus. I'm your host, Tim Klauser, with the Center Square's Washington State investigative reporter, TJ Martinell, here to talk about a request proposal from the state attorney general's office to potentially investigate you, me, anyone in the private sector. TJ, why don't you tell us a little bit more about this bill and what opponents or critics are warning it could do?
Yeah, I think what's going on is that the income tax proposal has drawn so much attention and been so controversial that this one is kind of slipping under the radar to an extent, even though we've been trying to cover it as much as possible. There's these things called civil investigative demands, and the Attorney General's office has the ability to issue these regarding potential violations of certain state laws, not a lot of them, just a handful of them. And what they're called SIDs. You can get a document, you can request that somebody, entity, an individual, give you documents, provide written testimony, or turn over any private stuff that they have that they believe is related to this potential violation. And so this bill, Senate Bill 5925, would expand that to a whole bunch of different laws, and including the U.S. and state constitution. And so that means that anybody that they think has violated any of these laws or the constitutions, they can issue a SID to someone. And It's effectively, they don't need a bench warrant because it's a civil matter. So they're not investigating people for criminal reasons. Then the other part of it is they can go to a court and say, hey, we want to have you issue a gag order so that the person who's receiving the SID, they can't talk about it publicly. And then if they don't comply with the request for these to turn over these documents or testimony, they can get the court to issue sanctions over a civil matter. So that basically criminally prosecute somebody who doesn't comply with this kind of stuff. So that's what we're looking at here. Practically speaking, it means that the Attorney General's office can issue this to anybody they want. They do, as the bill is written now, they do have to provide reasons and they have to make their case. Originally, they wouldn't have had to do that. So that's where things are at right now.
So you would expect this kind of thing for a pretty heinous crime, something that would be typical to investigate. But you're saying this bill drops the bar pretty low so far that you're saying that they don't even need to get a warrant from a judge. They can just come after you for these materials.
Yeah, that's pretty much what's going on. Is they can issue a SID, and make a demand. And I think the one part that's really fascinating in terms of the legality is the compelled testimony, because that I'm struggling to understand how that gets around Fifth Amendment protections, where you have the right to remain silent. And they're saying you have to not only talk to us, but you need to provide testimony, either written or verbally. And so what if somebody just refuses to talk? Or can the court basically issue sanctions to them? I mean, and this bill would apply as one, I think it was the county prosecutor for Spokane said, this can be targeted towards elected officials, for someone running for public office. And it's important to note that people will say, well, it's only over civil matters. You're not going to be criminally prosecuted. Well, one, what if they do? Obviously, if they do find criminal stuff, then they can, forward that to a prosecutor who can go after them for that. But I think more of it is, it gives them access to people's private information. And before somebody says, if you've done nothing wrong, you have nothing to hide. Well, that's not how the country works. That's not what America was about. And we have due process and, the requirement that you get a judge warrant before you enter somebody's house. But that is an important distinction. Under this bill, they cannot legally enter your property and seize records. That's what a warrant allows them to do. Whereas this, you have to provide it yourself.
How would that work for, say, like digital communications, whether it be phone records, emails, text messages and stuff?
That's where it would get really dicey, because what if they're requesting emails? And the problem is that, okay, that person, where's that? What if that data is on a server that's not located in the state? I mean, there's a reason why a lot of countries, I mean, with the whole Patriot Act thing, this is kind of separate, but that people would store their information on servers in different countries based on some of the federal laws. So yeah, it is a big question of like, well, if they ask for emails or for data that's stored on a server in another state, there's so many different legal questions that are being raised. It really comes down to what the stated purpose of it is. I mean, they could go after a business that's cooperated with ICE to see, arguing that somebody's civil rights has been violated. And, they've got that new law that says that employers have to inform employees of a ICE, I don't want to say raid, but just, if the government's requesting information about the legality of their workers there. Mm-hmm. And so if they cooperate with federal authorities, could they run afoul of this law? There's the Keeping Families Together Act, I believe it's what it's called. That's one of the laws that this would apply to. So I'm guessing that that's where we can expect to see SIDs issued. But the other thing is where they say you can't go public about it. And I think what's interesting is just how, in contrast that is with other provisions, as far as like, they want people to notify employees that they're being investigated, by ICE or by the federal authorities over immigration. But when somebody's being investigated by them, the Attorney General's office, they don't want them going public with it.
Yeah, it's an interesting caveat there. I mean, they want this power to be able to investigate people for alleged violations of law, the U.S. and state constitution. But at the same time, it's giving this extraordinary power to essentially a one-party state for the last several
Right.
decades, in a time where we're pretty divided, East versus West. Maybe not so much in the legislature, considering the size of the majority party, but when you give a party this power, I mean, not to say that they're going to use it for nefarious reasons, but it raises concerns.
I think, yeah, the question is like, okay, worst case scenario with a civil infraction. Okay, so I think the question then is, how is this actually going to get used in the end? I think the other thing is, what effect is that going to have on in terms of chilling people's political activism, their free speech? What happens when people who are violating the state constitution, the United States Constitution, where because they are politically aligned with the whoever's attorney general at the time, they don't get investigated? Selective enforcement, selective use of this power. Yeah, it's really amazing that and this came at the request of the Attorney General's office. So this wasn't something that a lawmaker just decided, hey, I'd like to give the Attorney General's office more power. The Attorney General's office went to them and said, we want more power. I think the other thing that's really, I don't know if I want to use the word fascinating, but kind of remarkable, is there was testimony by the Attorney General's office on this bill. And when people were talking about what's the accountability if it's misused, she said one of the people testifying from the Attorney General's office said you can go to this Washington State Bar Association. Well, there's a couple problems with that. One, the Washington State Bar Association only investigates lawyers as private attorneys. The investigations are confidential unless there's disciplinary action. And even then, they don't have the authority to ultimately suspend someone's license. They'd have to go to that goes to the state Supreme Court to make that decision. And the State Bar Association does not investigate people for criminal behavior, right? And so those investigations are confidential. Then the SID is, if it's kept a gag, if there's a gag order on it, how can they go to the State Bar Association? So and then they say, somebody might say, well, we'll go to the ethics board. The ethics board is a arm of the Attorney General's office. So, what are the consequences for when someone, what I think it was Jim Walsh, Representative Jim Walsh said, who watches the watchman? I mean, that goes back to that, classical ancient question, like who's going to hold them accountable to make sure that this is not going to be misused?
Yeah, I'm really interested to see where the bar lands with this law, if it is adopted. I mean, in a state that's laws vary widely compared to federally in other states. I mean, in terms of, for example, gun control, the state passed a law a few years ago prohibiting the sale of just assault rifles in general. Now, if the AGO sees videos online of people shooting assault rifles, even though they owned them prior to the ban, are they going to start requesting emails and stuff to see when this firearm was purchased? I mean, with the state's hate crime laws expanding, are statements made on X and Instagram and Facebook going to be put underneath the spotlight?
I think that's the thing, is they can issue. One of the critics' arguments is that this allows them to do fishing expeditions to find something, anything, if they're trying, because they may not end up launching an investigate or filing a civil prosecution or whatever it's called, pursuing legal action as a civil infraction, but it may give them information that they need for something else. This is if you had somebody maliciously using this process to obtain information that you need for something else that you're doing. And it's going to discourage people from, potentially from wanting to get involved politically, to run for public office, to criticize the Attorney General's office, to do anything where they might end up having their personal documents, being forced to turn them over. The other provision is somebody can challenge the SID, but they have to go to court. So you basically have to go, instead of the Attorney General's office having to convince a judge to let them have this power, which they need to do with a criminal warrant, the person in question has to spend their time and energy to sue. And then if they lose, now they got to spend their time and energy to collect the documents and records provided. That also raises a separate question. What if they just say, we don't have these documents? Sometimes I file a records request and an agency will say there's no relevant documents to your request. So what if they just say it doesn't exist, and now the Attorney General's office is going to have to prove that it's not the case. But then that also raises the question: is does that person have to prove that something doesn't exist and never existed? So
where's the proposal at now? I mean, is it past one chamber? Is it nearing adoption? We got about a little more than 3 weeks left in the session. Are they going to have time to pass it?
I mean, that's going to be the question. Is I think that it cleared the Senate, and it is actually scheduled for a committee vote in the Committee on Civil Rights and Judiciary on February 24th. So we'll see what happens there. It's obviously going to have to get to the House floor and get a vote there, and then obviously whether it's signed by Governor Ferguson or not. But I think that this is, if it does pass, it's going to be it's going to probably get. I'm imagining there's going to be some sort of legal action taken against it before it, because it goes into effect in 90 days after the bill is passed.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see if it does pass, what lawsuits come out of it and how the state reacts, especially considering that the governor that signed it, Governor Ferguson, he was our current state AG, Nick Brown's predecessor.
Right.
So really interested to see how this pans out. Appreciate you covering it for us, TJ, and thank you for joining us for another segment of Washington in Focus.
So that is a wrap for Friday, February 20th edition of Washington in Focus Daily. Next week is going to be a big one here because Tuesday brings another public hearing on the income tax bill. So my email inbox today clogged with numerous groups urging people to sign in pro or con. And also want to tease something that we're going to be covering on Monday. I'm going to be over the weekend interviewing former State Attorney General Rob McKenna for his take on the income tax bill. He believes it is patently unconstitutional. So we'll have that take of his to share with you on Monday, again, ahead of that next public hearing on the bill on Tuesday here in Olympia. So check out our page at thecentersquare.com/Washington. Easy for me to say. I think I've lost all my energy by the end of this week. But I wish you a great weekend and appreciate you watching another episode of Washington in Focus Daily.